This is Report to Wyoming.
I'm Colby Fedor, and for this segment, I'm going to play about 30 minutes from the May 27th City of Casper Council work session. They are talking about fiscal year 2026's budget. The voice you'll be hearing from first is City Manager Carter Napier.
And the broad context of the budget and what it is that ultimately I hope you'll approve in the second meeting in June, which means that once we're at that point, we're pretty much at a point of no return as far as passing the budget goes. So tonight is meant to give you these broad insights, ask questions, but the reality is you have a review period starting tonight up until that second business meeting in June, which is the third Tuesday in June. We're going to be discussing this evening a budget of $183 million, which, as you probably recall, is less than what it is that you passed back in fiscal year 25. That $183 million, nearly $184 million, is representative of all the expenses that we have throughout the entire organization. I'd like to give a shout out to the folks who are here tonight, all of the staff that you see here behind you. All of them had a hand in putting together this battery of information. The budget that you've been reviewing actually over the last several days. And I can tell you that without their input and without their work and so on, not only would the budget not be completed, but it wouldn't be completed in the reasonable and responsible manner that you have likely picked up on. And so my appreciation to staff. They put a lot of work into this thing. Thank you. A lot of work into the budget, and we tried to make the hard work seem easy as it relates to passing what's in front of you tonight. Just so you're aware, I would represent to you that aside from capital type expenses and so on, the budget is well within the means that you have authorized in terms of expenses and revenues and so on that you would otherwise consider. So I would tell you that we are balanced. We're living within our means as it relates to the proposal you have in front of you. And we are not using reserves. We're not unnecessarily growing reserves. In my estimation, with respect to all the variables that I would think are important to you, that you have expressed are important to you, we've tried to stay within. I do think, though, that it would be important to talk about the rules of canon, if you will, that we try to follow as it relates to preparing the budget. I know I've had a few meetings, particularly since the new year started, wherein a lot of those cardinal rules, if you will, pertaining to budget design and so on have been challenged and questioned and those kinds of things, not necessarily by any of you, but with regard to a lot of folks that I talked to or heard from and those kinds of things. And so maybe to set the table for tonight's discussion, I could go over that with you a little bit. And I'd like to start that with discussing on very broad strokes the revenue that we work with. You all know that we generally work with revenue that we can anticipate having every year. I call it perennial revenue, operational revenue, the revenue that is in the form of like sales taxes or rate-based revenue. Those are revenues that are very predictable, very plannable, or at least reliable in the sense that we can anticipate getting installments every year. The less perennial and maybe not as widely reliable from a year-to-year existence are those what we call one-time revenues that we try to balance against the series of one-time expenses that we have from time to time. Usually that's in the form of capital. We use capital expenses and capital dollars matched up against each other, balanced against each other. Oftentimes it also includes non-capital kinds of expenses like, computers or things that don't quite rise to the level of capital, but nonetheless are more one-time in their nature than they are current liabilities and so forth, like salaries and paying the light bills and so on might be. So that rule that we try to follow is we don't plot one-time revenue against ongoing current expenses and liabilities. That's really important from our perspective to follow, and hopefully from your perspective as well, in that, to me, it's a good measure of actually living within our means. If we're trying to balance the budget on money that we know is going away next year, for example, to me, that doesn't feel like a real responsible means of budget planning and budget design. Okay? So that is our first cardinal rule that I wanted to talk to you about tonight. The second one that I wanted to go over with you is with regard to moving into the next slide, please, Peter. Thank you. Is that of the cross-pollination that some have talked about as it relates to, the water fund, for example, or the sewer fund, for example, and its relationship with the general fund. We don't use water fund revenue to balance the general fund, as I think we've talked about from time to time. We try to keep those business operations balanced against the expenses and obligations that they have. Again, the water fund, in order to provide for the services that the water fund provides in its utility. The sewer fund is another good example. Sanitation is another good example. While we may have from time to time 1% money going into some of those, generally speaking, they are all fairly independent in their operation and in their relationship. Outside of a couple few related expenses that we call the administrative allocation. Typically speaking, what that means is if indeed the water fund and the sewer fund and so on were expected to provide their own HR department and their own attorney and their own board of directors and that kind of thing, they would have no need to share some of the expenses that is incurred in the general fund on their behalf. So instead of doing that, the water fund and the sewer fund, and again, so on, share parts and portions of the expenses related to HR, the expenses related to the attorney, and myself and finance and so on, so they don't have to replicate those services within each of the business enterprises. So outside of that, unrelated expenses, as the statute that is being cited there indicates, we really don't have the flexibility of using water revenue to balance the general fund at council's whim. In my opinion, statute just doesn't allow for that. Furthermore, I think it's really interesting that statute actually recognizes GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles, as the standard by which cities and towns ought to design their budgets. And so when we talk about things like the water fund being an independent business entity and so on, it's because GAAP recognizes that as the best business practice and would recommend that as over and above what the statute suggests as a good way to design a local government budget. And we follow that. Contrary to what some have suggested, we really don't violate or go astray from what you're seeing in front of you right now. It's sort of a cardinal rule. Okay. Another cardinal rule that we try to stick to is with respect to the way in which we use reserves. There's been a lot of conversation as well over whether or not the city of Casper is too well apportioned as it relates to the dollars that are tied up in reserves. You can see that, for example, one of the reserves that we cite here is the $17 million that's set apart in the general fund. That $17 million is predicated upon 120 days worth of operating expenses for the general fund and the services it hosts to operate for that 120 days. That too ties back to GAAP principles that are kind of an industry standard and recommendation. And we really haven't veered from that since the time that you passed that policy that requires every budget that we bring to you, have that set aside, put together. Okay, there's a number of reserves like that, however, a number of restricted balances and so on that I'd like to have you have by way of future reference, if we could. Wonderful. So there is the list. Thank you, Eric. That is the list, if you will. Is that mine? Okay. Thank you. Sorry. That's okay. That is the list of restricted accounts, reserves that, in my estimation, and with regard to planning and design principles of the budget you have in front of you, are what I would call inviolate. Or in other words, we really don't touch. Just a few examples. You see some on the screen, and you have, of course, the exhaustive list in front of you there. A good example would be, well, you see the general fund 120-day figure under reserves there, the first entry. Just about $17 million there. Another example would be the wastewater treatment fund. That is based on a 90-day operating reserve, but there's also a capital reserve that represents a year's worth of depreciation, which is also a standard, generally accepted accounting principle that is important for us to observe. Some of the smaller ones include the opioid settlement money. You all know that money is tied up very tightly with respect to directives from the settlement that class action lawsuit of which the city was a party can be used for. Therefore, we don't try to use that $1.2 million, anything outside of, number one, what the settlement dictates, and number two, the agreement that you have with the county in terms of fueling that committee effort that is underway right now. And of course, some of you are actually a part of. Another good example would be with respect to that sinking fund. If you notice in the restrict obligations category, that sinking fund is actually the statutorily mandated fund that the city has to set up to cover its portion of making sure that Fire Fund A remains solvent, as we have a number of members that are in that fund still, that retirement fund. So that 4.5 represents our commitment to that annual payment to the state and, of course, to that fund. So as you can see, this obligated and reserve category of funding really amounts to just about $97 million of funds that are tied up or are set apart for very specific purposes. You'll also probably notice, however, that the overall figure that we have in terms of cash on hand is $214 million. So when you take out that $96 million of funds that are tightly obligated either by policy or other obligation, you have roughly $118 million that is in abeyance for some reason or purpose. I would tell you that represents the effort that we take to adhere to the next cardinal rule, if you will, as it relates to cash on hand for capital ventures. A few years ago, I would say maybe 5 or so years ago, council gave me the direction to fund capital based on cash that we would have on hand to fuel the respective capital agenda. So, for example, when we bring forward a recommendation to build the landfill cell, whatever number that cell is, it escapes me right now, the next landfill cell, you can be assured that the money that we will use to build that cell will be money that we've saved over time through the rate model and so forth to make that construction happen. Okay? When we bring a road project to you that needs to be, reconstructed or whatever, you can be assured that by virtue of these funds that you see here on the bottom line, that street project will be able to be constructed because that couple $1 million or whatever that figure is on hand and available to make that project happen. This little analysis breaks down some of the conversation that's been occurring in the current fiscal year as it relates to what is now a $327 million budget that the city is working with for fiscal year 25, the current fiscal year that we're in. Council will recall that the original capital budget that we submitted a year ago today, not today, maybe this month, a year ago, included a $45.9 million capital agenda as a part of the $193 million, I think it was, that we were asking for in terms of overall budget. Since that time, however, Council has been willing to amend said budget in order to roll over $100 million, just over $100 million in capital budgets that were in some form of completion. Some of those projects were close to getting done in the previous fiscal year, but needed to be rolled over in terms of that respective spending authority to the current fiscal year. Some of those projects are just getting started, and some of those projects are in the middle of being completed. Nonetheless, right now, particularly when you include the $10 million that are going on with regional water, staff is working on with some degree of commitment throughout that capital continuum of about $154 million worth of work, $156 million worth of work. At some stage of completion, some stage of involvement between the city and the $10 million out of regional water, we have our hands, staff has their hands in that level of capital activity. By virtue of some of the meetings that we just recently had and some of the approvals that you've just very recently given us the green light for, you can expect that in fiscal year 26, at the very, very least, on top of the $0.6 million that we're asking for in FY26, if the state agrees and if we can get the funding that we're pursuing, we're going to have at least another 40 that we're going to be bringing forward in the form of utility work that needs to be completed in the next fiscal year and beyond as well. So oftentimes when these kinds of numbers are being discussed and talked about and so on, the context is really what it is that you see here, how we've broken it down, basically, in regards to what the current fiscal year will look like and what likely the next fiscal year will look like. It is primarily relegated to the deployment of capital. Okay? And by the way, just so you're aware, we're asking for $183 million of budget authority for fiscal year 26. I just mentioned that last fiscal year we were somewhere closer to the neighborhood of 193 and 95 million. The reality is the general fund, as it makes up a portion of that budget, obviously, is in the neighborhood of $56.1 million that we're asking for your blessing to move forward with, which is about 1% less than the general fund we will be concluding here in just a few short weeks for fiscal year 25, which we anticipate being in the neighborhood of $56.7 million by the time we wrap up our final accounting for the fiscal year we're in right now. So from that standpoint, the general fund as well is actually a smaller proposal, albeit not by much. Talking about 1% variance maybe in terms of in what we're looking for your blessing for. Any questions with respect to what we have covered thus far before we go into the breakdown of the general fund?
Question for Carter?
Go ahead, Al.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Carter. I guess where does this 118 million that's not captured in these obligations, these reserves, some portion of that is going to be the capital budget for the next year, because like you said, it's cash on hand capital budget, which was, I don't know what our capital budget is this year.
We're asking for $27.6 million.
Okay, so the 27 will come out of here as well. I guess my question is, where does the other 91 million live?
There's a variety of places that funding is going to be seen, if you will. As you know, we try to save up capital dollars from the current portion of the 1 cent 17 phase that we are preparing for. I would suggest that moving into this next fiscal year, you're going to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 to $15 million. A part of that 118 million will be relegated to our little savings account to get ready for the next 1% proposition capital agenda that you will see as we move through the fiscal year and so forth. Another example would be the cash that we're trying to build up, as I mentioned earlier, in the bill fill fund in order to build landfill cells and in order to close landfill cells. You'll see here in a few minutes, there's a balance of cash in that fund as well that, you know, we're trying to scrape together in order to bring to you a proposal to both close and open landfill cells. When it comes to equipment, rolling stock that we're waiting for delivery, as you know, there's been a lot of lead time associated with many of those pieces of equipment. That cash is tied up as well in some of these dollars here as we wait for those pieces of equipment to be delivered. So there is a variety and sundry of locations that you will find the total makeup of this $118 million that is being held in abeyance or being reserved for capital endeavors that we've tried to get completed.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Except I guess from my perspective, this 118 million is not necessarily available to spend. I mean, I guess it requires us parsing what that definition is, because it sounds like a lot of it is already allocated to spend and has yet to be spent. A lot of it's based on our cash-based capital budget, so maybe we have it to spend, but we already have a plan to spend it. So I guess I've gotten some questions from people, especially in the past week, asking about reserves. And in my opinion, 90-day operating reserve for our utility accounts. It's a reserve technically, but I agreed it's an obligation. We shouldn't touch it to abide by kind of general accounting principles. Same with our general fund, our 4-month operating reserve. Like that to me is not necessarily a reserve because it should be ironclad and we shouldn't touch it. To me, when people ask about what are the city's reserves, really like the perpetual care fund is really one of the only ones that I can think of that is, like in my opinion, a true reserve in the sense that it's money that we just kind of have socked away and use the interest revenue to help supplement the rest of our budget. And so I guess it would be helpful for me to know, beyond what we have as the corpus of the perpetual care fund, what else is that really the only like honeypot we have as far as like just a corpus or a amount of money just kind of sitting there that is not planned to be allocated, that, you know, we're simply just living off the interest revenue. Does that make sense? So I don't know if I've found where I was going with that or if it was just me meandering aloud. But
well, and I would say the short answer is yes. You're hitting on the right points in my mind. Perpetual care is one that councils before you have set apart so that an interest revenue income source could be generated over time to help offset the needs that a lot of your 1% buildings can be benefited by. And we're going to go through that in a lot more detail here. That figure is about $920,000 as far as interest income is concerned from perpetual care. The Opportunity Fund, not listed on this sheet, but indeed with respect to the $5 million that sits in the Opportunity Fund, 3.2 of it, you all know, is set aside for the ice arena. And while it doesn't show up to the point of being a restricted amount of money because it doesn't quite meet that accounting standard for being included on this list, comfortable that you have committed that $3.2 million at least until the end of this calendar year. So there's a variety of things like that you're right, may not have shown up on this list, but indeed have dog ears associated to them and purposes in order to get projects done and continue moving forward. Because of that cash on hand doctrine that I think is extremely prudent policy to follow.
Sounds good.
Does that help?
It does. Okay. And I'm sure more light will be shed as we work through these plans.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, look at that figure in yellow right there. The general fund has currently an unobligated fund balance of $5.5 million, which I would suggest would be a part of that 118 as well. Okay? That $5.5 million is as yet unspoken for and is a residual balance in the general fund. Okay? You have used a balance like this in the past to do things like pay for jail costs that at one point in time were just totally high and unexpectedly so. We have sacked this balance in order to come up with the balance of that unanticipated increase. By the way, I don't see that happening over the next year. So that's another insight that you'll come upon as you look through the budget. However, as you balance the revenues against the general fund, that has a potential to add to that cash balance if, in fact, expenses are less than what you see here in the revenue that we're potentially going to expect in the general fund over the next fiscal year. That typically doesn't happen. We don't usually have that benefit of revenues being higher than expenses, but we also work extremely hard to make sure that expenses don't exceed revenues either in the general fund, because as you know, the general fund is a very vulnerable fund for us. Why is that? It's because 70% of the revenues that come into this fund are not controlled by you. They are controlled by other governments, the state and the county in particular. And so you really only have policy direction over roughly 30% of the revenues that come into the general fund. As a government entity, as a legislator for the city of Casper, you only get say of about 30% of the revenues that come into the general fund. And so that's why I call it one of your more vulnerable budgeting points, if you will, because you're kind of a subject to what happens at the state level, what happens at the county level, not a destiny you really get to control. As you can see in this breakout, a lot of the sale. Well, let's talk about sales taxes here for a second, and then we'll get back to some of the revenue strategies that we have otherwise here. Sales taxes is a big part of what it is that the general fund utilizes for its operations. We are suggesting a sales tax revenue stream of $24.5 million over the next fiscal year. You will probably note in your budget book that we are expecting to close the fiscal year having received somewhere in the neighborhood of 25.7, if I remember correctly, as far as the general fund is concerned in sales taxes. In my estimation, that is certainly a very conservative approach to take. I'm going to double check myself here. I don't like to be wrong. 24.7. I'm sorry. 24.7 is what we're anticipating closing the current fiscal year at with respect to the sales tax revenue. If you compare what it is that we're projecting, 24.5, to that particular figure, that's about 1% less than where we think we're going to close the year out at.
This has been Report to Wyoming, presented in the public interest by Town Square Media.
Here in America, work is in trouble. We've offshored our manufacturing, sent away good jobs, and lost so much ability to make things. American Giant is a company that's pushing back against this tide. They make high-quality clothing, sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more right here in the USA. Visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com, promo code STAPLE20.